The night the valley started burning its own homes to stay alive, one house did nothing at all. No frantic chopping, no doors ripped from hinges, no furniture fed into the fire, and somehow it stayed warm. On February 9th, 1947, the cold did not arrive like a storm. It settled in, slow, heavy, and certain. By nightfall, the thermometer nailed to a fence post outside town read 31 below zero. The wind did not howl. It pressed. Long, flat sheets of air sliding down from the Bighorn Mountains, pushing against every wall, every window, every weak seam a man had ever trusted. Inside most homes in Hardin, Montana, the fire was already losing. Wood stoves glowed red. Flames licked hard at iron walls. Men fed them constantly, arms aching, backs bent from a winter that never seemed to end. And still, the cold found its way in. Yet it slipped through window frames packed with cloth. It crept up from beneath floorboards laid too thin. It breathed through walls that were never meant to face something this relentless. By 10 that night, one family sat inside a house that had already fallen below freezing. A mother wrapped her child in wool blankets and pressed him against the dog for warmth. The boy's breath turned white in the air. The fire beside them cracked and fought, but it was losing ground with every passing minute. Her husband stared at the room like a man counting time. First went the spare chair, then the door frame. He did not hesitate, because out here, hesitation could cost a life. 3 homes on that same road began tearing pieces from their own walls before midnight, not out of panic, out of understanding. Fire meant survival, and survival meant sacrifice. But half a mile down that same frozen stretch of land, something didn't make sense. There was a house that wasn't fighting. No smoke rushing sideways from a desperate chimney. No lantern moving back and forth through frost-covered windows. Just a low, curved shape rising quietly from the earth, catching the moonlight like it belonged there. Inside that house, the temperature held steady, not warm by comfort, but warm enough to live, warm enough to sleep. If you have ever felt a winter that cuts through bone, you already know how impossible that sounds. And if this story reminds you of a place like that, tell me where you are watching from. These stories travel farther than the cold ever could. The house belonged to a man named Ray Callahan, and 2 years earlier, nobody believed he knew what he was doing. Ray had come back from war with very little, a small piece of land, a few $100s, and a mind that did not look at materials the way other men did. Where most saw a wall, he saw a weakness. Where most saw a roof, he saw exposure. He had spent years building under pressure, where mistakes were not discussed. They were revealed, quickly, brutally, without mercy. And somewhere in those years, watching how structures survived in places that were never meant for comfort, Ray began to understand something simple. The land itself was not the enemy. It was the solution. But Hardin, Montana was not a place that trusted strange ideas. The homes here followed a pattern that had not changed in decades: timber walls, shallow foundations, and wood stoves fighting a losing battle against long winters. Everyone knew the problem. No one had solved it. Until Ray stopped trying to fight the cold and started studying it. That first winter back, he didn't build anything. He watched. He stood outside in the evenings as the temperature dropped and paid attention to things other men ignored. How cold settled into low ground first. How certain slopes held warmth longer than others. How wind curved around hills instead of crashing into them. And then he did something that made people talk. He started digging holes, Not to build, to measure. Every morning before sunrise, he walked out with a simple thermometer and checked the earth at different depths. 1 foot down, 2 feet, 3, and then deeper. What he found changed everything. Or while the air above froze hard enough to crack wood, the earth below barely moved. 6 feet down, the temperature stayed near 50 degrees. Steady, quiet, unbothered by the violence happening above it. Ray stood there one morning, frost on his beard, breath sharp in the air, and realized something that most men had spent their whole lives missing. The ground was not cold. It only looked that way from the surface. And if a man could build a home that leaned into that hidden warmth, instead of standing against the wind, he wouldn't need to fight winter anymore. He would outlast it. By spring, Ray had made his decision. He wasn't going to build a house like everyone else. He was going to bury part of it, and place the rest where the wind could not touch it the same way. People laughed. They said he was digging his own grave. Bet said the cold would trap him, that the metal roof he planned to use would freeze solid and drip water inside, that the earth would flood his home the moment the snow melted, and maybe the harshest truth of all. Some of those fears were not wrong, but Ray had already accepted something most men hadn't. There is no perfect shelter, only better ones. So he picked up a shovel and started digging into frozen ground, not knowing yet that 2 winters later, when the cold came harder than anyone expected, every man who laughed would be forced to remember exactly what he built. By the time the ground finally softened in early spring, most men were just beginning to think about building. Ray was already deep in the earth, 6 feet down, a hole cut into frozen Montana soil, wide enough to swallow a house, and quiet enough to make a man question himself. The wind moved above him. Up there, it still ruled everything. Down here, it felt different, muted, like the cold had lost its voice. Ray stood at the bottom of that pit one evening, leaning on his shovel, feeling something no one else in Hardin had bothered to notice. The air was calmer, not warm, but not cruel. And that was enough. He didn't say much to anyone while he worked, but people talked anyway. They passed by in wagons and slowed just enough to look, a grown man, burying his own house. Some shook their heads, some laughed openly. A few just watched longer than they meant to, because deep down, every man in that valley knew the truth. Winter was winning, while anyone willing to try something different deserved at least a second look. Ray worked 11 days straight to finish the excavation. No machines, just a borrowed team of horses, a slip scraper, and a boy named Curtis, who needed the money more than he needed rest. By the time they were done, the earth they had moved sat piled behind the site, forming a low rise to the north and west. Ray did that on purpose. He had seen how the wind came, not straight, but angled, and if you gave it something to break against, even something small, it lost some of its bite. That pile of dirt would later matter more than anyone realized. Then came the stone. Not pretty stone, not cut or polished, just heavy limestone pulled from the Bighorn River, slab by slab, hauled by wagon and stacked by hand. 4,000 pounds of it. But most men would have built a simple wood frame and been done in half the time. Ray chose weight instead, because weight holds heat. He built the walls thick, thicker than anyone thought made sense. 18 inches of solid stone rising from the bottom of that pit, forming a foundation that did not just support a house. It absorbed it. Every piece placed with purpose, every gap filled, not to look good, but to last. By the time the walls stood chest high above the floor, The shape of something different had already begun to show. A house that did not stand on the land, but sat inside it. And then, the metal arrived. The Quonset panels came in on a flatbed wagon one hot June afternoon. Curved steel ribs, designed for war, not for homes. Most men had seen them before. Temporary structures, cold, loud, unforgiving, and the kind of thing you stored tools in, not slept inside. Ray saw something else. He saw shape, a curve that didn't fight the wind, but let it pass. A surface with no flat face for cold to press against. A form that, if placed right, could work with the land instead of against it. He anchored the steel directly onto the stone, not above it, inside it. So the curve of the roof didn't begin at the ground. It rose from within the earth itself. That detail changed everything. From the outside, the house barely looked like a house, just a low metal arc, half hidden, like something the land had swallowed. But inside, it felt different. The stone walls held a quiet kind of warmth. The floor, laid over gravel, stayed dry. The air didn't rush or whistle. It stayed. Yet even in early autumn, before the real cold had come, Ray could feel it working. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but steadily. And sometimes, steady is all survival needs. By October, he moved in. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a man, a stove, and a house no one believed in. The first nights were cold. He expected that. The fire had to teach the stone what warmth felt like. Day after day, night after night, the walls slowly began to hold heat instead of releasing it. It was not fast. Nothing about this house was fast, but something was happening, and Ray felt it before anyone else did, because he was the one sitting inside, listening to a space that did not fight him back. But outside, the talk didn't stop. A local builder called it a mistake waiting to happen, said the metal would freeze and drip, and said the walls would sweat and rot, said the ground would flood the moment spring came. A store owner warned people it was dangerous, said the curved roof would trap smoke, that there was no safe way out if something went wrong. Even the county men shook their heads, said no serious man builds down into the cold. You build up, away from it. That had always been the rule, and Ray quietly broke it. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince anyone, because he had learned something most men hadn't yet. You don't prove a structure with words, you prove it with winter. And winter was coming again. Right here, before we move forward, hold on to this thought for a moment. Every man in that valley believed they understood the cold. They had lived with it their whole lives. But understanding something and surviving it are not always the same thing. Ray knew that, and soon the valley would too. Because when February returned, it didn't just test his house. It exposed every weakness the others had been living with for years. The cold did not knock that winter. It arrived like a verdict. On the evening of February 8th, 1947, the temperature fell faster than any man in Hardin expected. Not slowly, not gently. It dropped hard, and then refused to rise again. By midnight, the air had turned sharp enough to burn the lungs. By morning, it was holding below 25 degrees under zero, and it stayed there. Not for hours, for days. 4 long days where the sun offered no relief, and the wind carried nothing but weight. Inside most homes, the fight began immediately. Men woke through the night to feed their stoves. Axes split wood until hands went numb. Fireboxes roared hot, but the heat never stayed. It slipped through thin walls, escaped through loose boards, vanished into a winter that gave nothing back. One family burned nearly a full cord of wood in a single night. Another ran out before dawn. By the second day, people started leaving their homes. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Furniture disappeared into flames, door frames, shelves, anything that would burn. Survival had narrowed down to one simple choice: burn it or freeze. But half a mile outside town, something quiet was happening. A house that should have failed wasn't. Inside Ray's Quonset home, the fire had already settled into coals. The stove was no longer roaring, and still, the warmth remained. Not strong, not comfortable, but steady. 58 degrees inside, while the world outside sat at -28. A difference so large, it didn't seem real. Curtis Pruitt walked through that door before sunrise on the second morning. He had come for a tool. He stayed because he couldn't understand what he was feeling. The moment he stepped inside, the cold let go of him. Not completely, but enough to notice. Ray sat at the table in a wool shirt. No coat, no hat, just eating breakfast like it was any other day. Curtis looked at the thermometers. Outside, nearly 30 below. Inside, holding steady. And the stove had not been touched in hours. That was the moment everything changed, because what Ray had built wasn't just working, it was holding. The stone walls had been quietly storing heat for weeks. Every fire he had burned, every evening he had fed the stove, had been building a reserve. And now, in the worst cold the valley had seen in years, that reserve was giving it back. Slowly, steadily, without panic, without loss. The earth surrounding the house held its quiet temperature, 49 degrees, untouched by the chaos above. The wind moved across the curved roof instead of tearing heat away. The structure didn't fight the cold. It ignored it. Over 4 days, Ray used nearly half the wood of any other home his size. His lowest indoor temperature never dropped below 54. While others woke to frozen water beside their beds, Ray woke to something close to normal. And perhaps the strangest part of all, he slept through one of those nights. The fire went out, completely. And still, the house did not collapse into freezing. It held. That alone told the truth no one wanted to admit. Everything they had been building was leaking heat faster than it could be made. Ray had changed that, without bigger fires, without more wood, just by understanding where warmth actually lives. By the time the cold broke, the valley was different. Not louder, not dramatic, just quieter. Men who had laughed stopped laughing. One of them drove past Ray's place that afternoon, slowed his truck, looked at that low metal curve rising from the snow, and for the first time, didn't have anything to say. Spring came slowly that year, but when it did, people started walking again, visiting, talking, comparing what had been lost and what had been saved. And then something small began to happen. That one man added stone to his north wall, another buried part of his foundation. Someone dug deeper under their floor. No one copied Ray exactly, but they didn't ignore him anymore either, because winter had already made the argument for him. Ray never stood in front of a crowd, never claimed he had found the answer. He simply lived in what he had built, year after year, quietly proving that there was another way. And maybe that is what matters most in stories like this. Not that a man invented something new, but that he remembered something old. Long before timber homes, before thin walls and constant fires, people had already learned how to live with the land instead of against it. They built into the earth. They used weight. They trusted shape and patience and time. Ray didn't fight winter, but he stepped out of its path, and in doing so, he stayed warm while others burned pieces of their lives just to survive. If this story made you think, even for a moment, about the way we build today, then it was worth telling. And if you believe old knowledge still has a place in the world we live in now, stay with us, because there are more stories like this waiting to be remembered.